to Quilting on the Side, the podcast where we uncover the secrets to turning your passion for quilting into a profitable side hustle.
I'm Tori from the Quilt Patch by Tori.
And I'm Andi from True Blue Quilts. And together we're your co-hosts on this exciting journey of creativity, entrepreneurship, and all things quilting.
We're here to help you navigate the world of quilt pattern design, course creation, digital marketing, and running an online quilt business. We've been through the ups and downs ourselves, so we know what it takes to make money from your favorite hobby.
Welcome back. We're in season 3 already of Quilting on the Side, and we are so excited to have Paula Chamberlain with us this evening. Tori and I met Paula because she is a fellow podcast hostess, and she has actually inspired us on our journey. So Paula, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Tell us a little bit about how you got started quilting and when you decided to dive into the world of podcasting.
Well, I started quilting when a friend's mother-in-law gave her a bunch of baby clothes that had been her husband's baby clothes. And the mother-in-law wanted her to make a quilt. So I went to the library and looked up quilting stuff. And then happened to see a quilt demonstration at a local community center and ended up signing up for a class. So that's how I started my quilting journey. And I picked up quilting, and my friend who was given the clothes did not.
So did you make the quilt for her out of the...
No.
Well, yeah, I've heard sometimes those projects can take on a life of their own. But I'm so glad you found this hobby.
Me too. It's turned into my life. It seems like everything seems to come back to quilting and my podcast.
Yeah. And tell us how the podcast got started.
Well, my husband started a podcast first, and I was attending podcast conferences, and we went on 2 podcast cruises. So by the second cruise, I decided I would announce that I was having a podcast too. I think I continued to do this podcast. I've been doing it for 5 years, but part of it is because people say I can't do it. So therefore, I'm going to do it. When I was on that cruise, I had actually thought I would start a podcast called Shy People Have Opinions Too. But I found out or thought about it and realized it was going to be hard to get shy people on my podcast. So that was going to be a little difficult. So I thought about it more, and at the same time I had started quilting and wanted to listen to podcasts out there, and there were some good ones. There's even some great podcasts out there, but they would tell a little bit of their background and then be off onto sharing quilting tips or just different things about quilting. So we just got a very small peek into people's lives. And I thought, well, who are these people? And I thought that would probably make a good podcast because that's something I wanted to hear while I was quilting. So that's how I chose my quilting podcast.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that's really neat that you dove into the podcasting world and then brought it into the quilt world, a great weaving of hobbies. So what are your tricks when you were thinking about talking to shy people? What have you built up as your structure there for, because I know a lot of us quilters are not ready-made for interviews or, being on a microphone or a camera. So what have you learned from that respect?
Well, I have been part of Christian Podcasters Association, which really helps sharpen some of the skills. And also, like I said, I had already been going to the podcast conferences and knew several podcasters. And at the conferences, there's always talk and how to do things better. One of the best things that helped me was we had 1 minute to tell people what our podcast was about. We were at tables. There was about 8 people at a table, and we each had 1 minute. And of course, the first couple times I really stumbled through that. But it really, you switched up, got a different table, different people, and you had to do it again. So getting down what my podcast was about helped me a lot. Also, at the beginning, I had my list of questions, but I didn't have them as clear as what I have them now. So that helps. In, like you said, I'm interviewing a lot of people that have not been on a podcast before. So I tend to I do send my list out ahead of time so that they know what's coming. And I think that gives comfort to a lot of people. But also, rather than do 2 calls like a lot of podcasters do, they do a pre-call to let people know what's going to happen. I spend the first 10 to 20 minutes sometimes going over a small list, and it has seemed to make the episode or recording go smoother than it had in the past.
Yeah, I can certainly commend you on that as a guest. The process is very easy, very helpful, as you said, to have the questions ahead of time, and then the little bit of coaching that happens at the beginning of the call. And I certainly appreciate only having one meeting time. I know people just are busy, and so finding one convenient time can be tricky, let alone 2, if you say that some podcasters like to have that pre-show meeting. That would be kind of tricky to coordinate sometimes. So where have you found your guests?
I'm trying to remember where I found Tori. I'm not sure. I know I found you on Alignable. So
yeah, that's right. That's a great resource. And for our audience, if they're unfamiliar, Alignable is kind of like a local business forum. Is similar to Facebook and LinkedIn, but certainly for local businesses. So yeah, that's a great place to reach out. In the early days, were you talking to people from your local quilt guild or local area, people that you knew in real life?
Well, that was another reason I wanted to start the podcast, was to talk to quilters, in that I was not part of a quilt guild at that time. I joined my first quilt guild just last year. It was word of mouth. There was a few people I knew and reached out. I'd see something on Facebook, I'd reach out. I've even looked on Google Maps, looked up quilt shops in different areas, and their phone number's right there. I've been able to call them and get a few interviews that way too.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, people are so digital these days that we forget that, just reaching out with a human voice will a lot of times get a better response. The name of your podcast is A Quilter's Life, and you've said you really want to dive into people's stories. So I'm imagining you cast a fairly wide net. Have you ever wanted to niche down into any certain, like interview applique people or, certain demographics in the quilt world?
Right. I have laughed so many times because other podcasters in my group say, you have such a niche podcast. And I'm like, oh, if they only knew the world of quilting. I interview all quilters. It doesn't matter whether they're an applique quilter, an art quilter, a traditional quilter. They're modern. There's so many, and they have no clue when they think I have a niche podcast. But I have realized that my niche is my perspective. Like you said, I do their life. Mm-hmm. I just have one guest per episode, and we talk about them. We talk about their background, and then we talk about what they like about quilting, and then if they have a business, we talk about their business.
So you're not necessarily coming at this as, hey, quilters, here's this new great designer, teacher, whatever the business side is trying to promote. You're looking more at anyone and everyone who's made a quilt is ready to tell their story.
Yeah. I feel like I have two focuses. My first focus is to get the story of an older quilter. For example, earlier this year, January, February, I had the opportunity to interview a lady that was 101 and still quilting. And that was so fun to get her story and where she came from and all that. But earlier in May, I got an email from her daughter-in-law, and she passed away in May. And she made it to 102. She was 102 in April. So, but in that email, she thanked me so much for recording that story. So now they have that story. Yeah, we talked about quilting and we talked about things she liked, but they now have her story recorded. So that is my first priority. The second priority is, after having been in business for quite a while, I know how hard it is for a startup company, an individual company, to promote themselves. And so getting their story, their background, if people listen to their episode, they're going to find out who this person is, and they'll feel like, hey, I have a new best friend, and yeah, I want to buy from you. So that's my secondary focus, is to help these quilt businesses get going and share their stories.
Well, you are just a treasure for the quilt world, both, like you said, with those two priorities, being able to document people's stories, and that wonderful 102-year-old quilter that you interviewed. What a treasure for her family to have her story in her own words. You've captured her voice, and so many people can hear that. So that is wonderful. And certainly the efforts that you're making to promote other quilt businesses and make those connections for us all is wonderful. And I certainly appreciate it from my perspective as an online quilt business. So thank you for doing that, for stepping out. But I'm sensing that this is just kind of a labor of love, passion project, that you're not going at it as a income stream or a quilt business for yourself. You're just on the observation side. Talk to us about that decision.
Well, like I mentioned, we've been entrepreneurs for a long time. And so we have our own business. I am keeping books for a couple different companies that are my clients. And it's not like I could drop my own business to go to work for myself when I'm already working for myself. So, yeah, it has become a secondary hobby and passion, like you mentioned. I'm not ruling out that someday I may do something, but the more I think about it, I think, well, I don't want to be in competition with my guests, since I love sharing their stories and want to promote them. I don't want to be in competition with them. And I could get sponsors, but again, doing my own thing, I don't want someone telling me what I can and cannot do with my podcast.
Sure, it's your baby. You want to maintain that control. I totally get that. Are there pressures anywhere to change your structure, or to change that decision and think about monetization or anything?
No, there really isn't. The only thing would be is, in a couple years, we're hitting retirement, and we will see if I can still cover my costs. Now, if I can't cover my cost, that's going to change that. And I may just have to reach out and see what my community wants to do. You know, if they're not willing to pay for something at that point, then I might not be able to continue. But as of right now, I'm set and we keep going.
So, Paula, I saw that you had joined Instagram not too long ago, and it was really starting to grow and really fast. And I was really cheering you on. So I was wondering about your social media strategy and what you've done to grow your audience.
Well, it's actually been organically grown. Obviously, the people that are guests on my podcast are anxious to share their stories, so it goes out that way. I know people are listening to it from just typing in quilt podcast and seeing what comes up. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. We all know how algorithms work. But so I don't feel like I have a good answer for that question, but it really has been organic. And I post on Facebook and Instagram basically every once in a while on LinkedIn.
So have you tried to do any type of newsletter to promote the podcast, or are you just kind of letting it be with people that are searching for it and your promotions on social media?
Yeah, I do have an email, and people can sign up for the email list, but all I put on there is, here's the episode this week. It's short. It has the intro that I have on that episode, and it has a link to my website. And that's all I do in the newsletter or email. I figure if people are interested in signing up to be the first to hear that an episode is out, that's what they'll get. But so I have not grown my email list. If I had something to sell, I would be working a lot harder on that email list.
Sure. I bet. Talking about that kind of word of mouth and that organic and just kind of how everything gets linked together, the 6 degrees of separation that we all have with celebrities.
And Paula, I'd like to ask you, have you ever found any surprising connections between people who you've interviewed?
Well, you asked a little bit ago about how I go about getting people, and I was running out of guests last month, so it was time to start in on that. And I happened to look in a quilt magazine because I had bought it because Michelle Freeman had an article in there, and I had already interviewed her. Well, the next one was Jody Leonardo. So there was her email. So I reached out to her, and she interviewed with me, and then she gave me the name of Rochelle Rice. And boy, was I shocked, because I've been wanting to reach out to Rochelle just because we both have podcasts. She and Leslie have the Inappropriate podcast, or Inappropriate Quilter. And that was so much fun. And then when I interviewed Rochelle, I found out she'd already been listening to my podcast since 2020. And what a shock here. I thought she was this person that I couldn't approach, and here she'd been listening to me all along.
What a delightful surprise there. I love how those connections work, and you all of a sudden see a name and you're like, oh, you know her too? I love that. So do you have any teasers for other fun guests that are coming up, or past guests that you'd like to connect with again?
Well, everyone is so wonderful and amazing and exciting. But one of the very first episodes I did was with Jean Pickering, who's in her 80s. And I actually did that interview a year before I started putting the podcast out there. It took me quite a while to get the podcast going. But I am going to interview her soon. I just need to set the date. She said she'd do it. But my 5th anniversary is coming up in July, and I want her to be that episode. A lot has happened in her life. She's in her early 90s now. In the meantime, she remarried, and the other husband now has passed away. Um, can you imagine being 89 and getting married again? But she's just an amazing, amazing person, and I'm real excited for that episode coming up.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Turning a little bit to logistics, you have said that one of your goals is promoting quilters who are trying to build their business. And I hear a lot in the online space, so not necessarily just with quilter businesses, but throughout the e-commerce online world, that podcasting, and especially video podcasting now, is like the next big business thing. Did you find it difficult? Were there a lot of hoops to jump through to get your podcast started? Or was it more kind of a personal, do I really want to do this kind of barrier?
Well, like I mentioned, my husband already had a podcast. So, of course, I thought he has all the equipment. All I need to do is start podcasting. Well, he has a solo podcast, and I wanted to interview guests. So there were a few hurdles to jump in finding the right equipment. And if you listen to my earliest podcast, the stories are great, but the sound is, I'm still working on the sound, even 5 years now, but still, the sound's much better than it was, simply because I needed some different equipment. But we were in a good place because I already had those connections with a lot of podcasters. And let's see, like I mentioned, I've been doing it for 5 years, and I announced I was going to do it 2 years before that. And my husband was podcasting 1 or 2 years before that. So we've been in the community for a while, and we've seen a lot of podcasters come and go.
Who would you recommend as the best podcasting guru person to learn from if people are interested in exploring the world of podcasting?
Oh, that's a hard one. But we have a real good connection with John Lee Dumas and his wife, Kate Erickson Dumas. They're pretty well known. And I really credit Kate for getting the fire under me, because at one podcast conference, the speaker on the main stage was saying, throw out your first 9 episodes. Now, this was just before I was starting, and I thought, okay, I've interviewed 3 people, and they're expecting their story to be out there. How can I throw those out? So we went to a bowling event, and Kate was there, and I had a big discussion with her, and we sat down, and she said, Paula, just get them out. Just get them out. And so it was Kate that gave me that final shove, and I was able to get the podcast going.
Oh, that's wonderful. I know John Lee Dumas was also a big inspiration for Quilter on Fire, who is another well-known podcaster. So that's great to hear, and have that as a resource.
You have had over 700 episodes, and I'm really curious, how do you keep all the guest information organized? What does that look like behind the scenes?
Google. I love Google. I make a Google Doc for each person. I put the questions that I'm going to send them on that, and then make it specific to them. Then I copy and paste it into their email. And then I have their questions, which I print out and have when I do the interview. I love Google Calendar. Obviously, my Calendly program goes directly into my Google Calendar. So when people sign up for it, it's directly into the calendar. And I always put an event on a full day on Sunday with the number of episode it will be and their name, which means I have to have that edited and ready by that date so it will go out in the morning. So that's how I keep track.
Yeah, if people are listening and they want more specifics on, recording programs and that kind of thing, we can just leave us a comment, send us an email. We can certainly help with what our experiences have been. But you do all the editing yourself then?
I do.
So how are you juggling the time aspect? Do you still have time to quilt yourself?
Not as much as I hope, but I do. I focus that I need to get these quilts out. I still have great nieces and nephews that are waiting on their quilts. So yes, I do still quilt, but it takes about 10 or an hour of editing time for every 10 minutes I edit.
That's a good ratio to remember, and a good reminder that you don't need to go on forever. You can get some really good content out there in a short amount of time. So that has been a fascinating look behind the scenes at how a podcast comes together. But I think I want to dive into the rapid fire questions. So we are starting out, Paula, asking folks, what color do you struggle to include in your quilts?
I kind of giggled at this because I don't struggle with it because I don't think about that.
We'll get back to our interview with Paula in just a minute. But first, here's a message from our sponsor.
Hey there, Tori here with the Quilting on the Side podcast. Really quickly, I want to share some exciting news with you. I wrote a book. It's called Workshops Unleashed: How to Design Engaging and Successful Workshops for Quilters and Crafters. So if you're ready to have fun, make money, and truly connect with your students, Workshops Unleashed will guide you every step of the way. You'll learn how to craft sessions that resonate with your audience, attract more participants, and keep them coming back for more. With practical tips, templates, and marketing strategies, you'll discover how to turn your passion for teaching into a thriving business. And this book has everything you need to make your workshops a hit. You can pre-order now through September, your ebook or your paperback version of Workshops Unleashed, and you can check the show notes for the link. So I hope you enjoy this episode of the Quilting on the Side podcast.
Back to our rapid fire questions with Paula Chamberlain of A Quilter's Life podcast. So how do you choose colors then for quilt projects?
I go to the fabric store or the quilt shop and find something that pops out at me, a main fabric, and then I find other fabrics to go with it. But I also take my husband, and he helps me pick those out. So I love that he does that. He's real good at the color coordination and what goes together, so that our quilts are given, and I feel like he has a good input in them. So they're from both of us.
Our next rapid fire question is, do you prefer yardage or pre-cuts?
Yardage. I have never bought a pre-cut, and at QuiltCon I won a bag and there's pre-cuts in that, and I don't know what to do with it.
Start Googling for patterns. You can put in jelly roll patterns, and I'm sure you'd be overwhelmed with suggestions, but that's great. A favorite notion that you can't live without in your quilting space?
When I hear that question, I always think of my 6.5 by 24 ruler, because I was so amazed with that ruler when I first started using it. Now, the very first quilt I made before I did the quilt class, I pulled out a metal yardstick and drew my line. And I was so thrilled that I figured out a way to make that line straight, and I cut it with scissors. And, that was like in 2011. I didn't know about the rotary cutter or anything until my class. So that just amazed me. But there were 2 items, I wrote them down, out of 2 episodes that I had done. Tanya Mogari had recommended the diagonal seam tape, and I got that. I am thrilled with that suggestion. And then Lori Bernhardt had recommended thread nippers, and I bought some snips thinking, well, I'll just get snips and these are close enough. Well, they weren't. My sister ordered the actual thread snips that Lori had suggested, and I don't think I would want to do it without them anymore.
Yeah, we certainly can get attached to those special types of scissors. And you need several different kinds and sizes of scissors when you're sewing, for sure. Paula, what is the most rewarding part of having a podcast?
Getting the stories of these quilters, especially those older quilters, like I mentioned about Elsie Coleman, the 101-year-old quilter, and Dick Dupree. I don't know how old he was, but when I saw him on Facebook standing beside a quilt with his walker, I reached out and got his story. There are several that they're just these older quilters. They have their life story to share, and it's so much fun to get that.
Yeah, I think that's so wonderful, as you said, to be able to hear those stories and pass them down to new listeners, new friends. Now we can see on camera the lovely quilt right behind you, but we always are curious, how many quilts are in the room with you right now?
Well, I had to bring a couple in just because I knew you were going to ask this. But you can't see. I have twin beds in this room, and there's quilts on those that were made by Anonymous. I really don't know who made these quilts, but they are very old. One's a 9-patch and one's a bow tie quilt. I don't know, maybe my grandmother, maybe my husband's grandmother or great-grandmother. I have no idea how they ended up with us, but I have those on the bed. Then I just finished that one that's hanging up there that you can see. I just put the last stitches in the binding today. So that will be going out soon to another great nephew. I like putting their name on their quilt so that you can say, this is my quilt.
Paula is holding up a gorgeous quilt, a kind of medallion with a couple blocks and several borders. So hop over to YouTube and check it out. Oh, so pretty.
Well, the center blocks in that were my test blocks. And the fabric's not the greatest fabric. That's why I use them for making test blocks. And then I thought, well, I don't want to just set these aside. So I started, one of my favorite quilts that I have from growing up was given to our family. My dad was a pastor, so it was from the missionary barrel. And it had a center strip and then just borders around it. And I thought, I'm going to do that. So that's what I did with these test blocks. So I was pretty excited about that. I put that together yesterday. The center blocks are winding
ways, I think. That was my first thought. They're kind of the curved.
Yeah, that's what it's called, winding ways.
And we'd love to hear who is inspiring you right now.
I just interviewed her, but Megan Fowler, she just started Quilt Scouts. And when I saw that online, I thought, oh, that is brilliant. So Therefore, I think I am going to work on my curves patch, and that's why I made the quilt behind me. And I'm making the winding ways because they have curves in the blocks. And so that's inspired me on what I'm going to make right now.
How fun that you can hear those stories and get inspired and take action right away. That's wonderful. Okay, that I think wraps up our set of rapid fire questions. We want to thank you so much, Paula, for being with us, and tell people where they can find you.
You can find me at aquilterslife.com. I'm also on Facebook and on Instagram, all under A Quilter's Life. And that's ERS.
We look forward to many more stories from you, Paula. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Well, that was fun, turning the tables on Paula and having her be the guest after we've both been interviewed for her. It's always interesting to hear other people's perspectives on the process. So what was your biggest takeaway from Paula?
So from Paula's so sweet. I love her podcast, love the stories that she pulls out of people. But my biggest takeaway from our interview was probably how she grows her podcast organically, how she uses her referral network as her main way to get more guests. I think that's a lesson that all of us can take away, whether we're doing this for passion or for a business, is just asking, do you know someone who would like to be on my podcast? Do you know someone who'd like to take my workshop? Do you know someone who would love this pattern? Just inviting that and opening up that question and being brave enough to ask it. I think that can be a powerful way to grow your business and use your network. And the people who are enjoying what you're doing now can reach out and share it with their friends. And just, I think, starting that conversation, because not a lot of people will think about that until it's asked. So I think that was probably my biggest takeaway. What was your biggest takeaway, Andi?
I was really not necessarily inspired. I think the word would be comforted by the fact that she is not monetized. She is just doing this podcast because it's a fun avenue for her to talk to quilters and learn more about them and all about their life, because she says she starts with their quilt, but she really wants to know, where did you grow up? Tell me all the places you've lived, all that kind of stuff. So, and who doesn't like to be the center of attention and talk about themselves? So that's fun. And I think that's a good lesson for us as business owners in a creative space, that every single thing you create does not have to then become a product. It was, again, I'm so thrilled that she agreed to let us interview her rather than the other way around. And I hope she continues this and gets all the stories out there. I just think it's a wonderful insight into the quilters world, and hearing those individual stories is so special.
And if you are looking for, I want to flip this on the head just a little bit, but her stories, she's talking to not just business owners, but just quilters as well. So she's got a beautiful mix, and it's a great study of your ideal client as well. So just looking at this from a business perspective, not only are they fun stories to listen to, where you get to hear about people's lives, their quilting, and their favorite things here and there, and they're really fun to listen to, but it's also a study of your ideal customer. So it's really fun. I used to listen to them all the time when I was making my pattern samples. And so I'd be sewing and listening to these stories. I listened to her podcast for hours. The first time I heard of her podcast was when she reached out to me, and I listened to 4 episodes in a row, and I'm just like, this is awesome. I cannot wait to be on her podcast because it was so much fun to hear their stories. So if you are a story person, you're going to love her podcast. So definitely take a listen.
For sure. Well, let us know, audience, what you thought of kind of the behind the scenes world of podcasting. And as always, if you have suggestions for future show topics or any questions about the quilt business, podcasting, whatever.
And if you know someone who'd like to listen to our podcast, let them know about our podcast.
Yeah, like and share. It helps us more than you know. So thanks again, and we will be back soon.